Today we've got a great story of malicious compliance that takes place in 15 minutes. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, new manager putting productivity over everything. I worked at a call center of nurses to give advice on whether the caller needed to go to the ER, GP, manage symptoms at home, etc., etc. As it's health advice, it's crucial to document everything. Because if someone was, for example, instructed to stay at home while exhibiting clear stroke symptoms, we would be responsible. Well, a new manager was hired above our own floor manager to increase productivity. As the number of calls were increasing rapidly, beginning of COVID, she felt it necessary to reduce the time we spent on finishing documenting after the call had ended. In addition to medical records, we had to fill out a short questionnaire about each call to monitor the reasons people call us. Internal purposes, not really my expertise, so it obviously took a while. Average time I think was around 3 minutes after each call. The new manager informed us that 90 seconds was going to be enough, and she asked the IT department to make the program push us a new call after those 90 seconds, whether we were ready or not. The call would ring loudly, first on headphones and after 10 seconds on the computer's sound system. New patient information screen popped up. Everything unfinished was pushed to the back, and we had to either decline the call, only allowed in emergencies, or let it ring and try to work over the ringing, which could not be muted. It was horrible. The noise was unbearable, and just in a few hours, we workers complained so much that the new managers just told us to take the new call and finish up the old one while talking to the new patient. Cue malicious compliance. Patient information law, similar to HIPAA in the US, violations, here we come. Having two patients' info up at the same time, trying to figure out why the latter called and wrapping up the previous one. How many documentations were written on the wrong patient's records? We tried. It was even worse than before. It took us about an hour to realize it would never work, and so we took the new call, asked them to wait for a second, muted the call, and finished up the previous one. The customers were not happy, but us workers gladly directed them to avenues to give feedback through. The company got so many bad reviews and online complaints in the first 6 hours that they had to regroup and stay late on that Monday evening to undo everything. We went back to normal on Tuesday, 2 hours later than we should have opened due to reprogramming. The new manager was with us less than 3 months. Don't miss her a bit. I had the most chaotic, headache-inducing 8.5 hours of my life that day. Still have nightmares of that ringtone. And sadly, I feel like this is just par for the course as far as anything relating to healthcare goes. Yet another part of the healthcare chain that you call up, sometimes in dire situations, and you get somebody that's overworked and can't even really give the full focus that you probably need. Alcohol 183 wrote, I worked several call centers. I had so many higher-ups not understand that 90 seconds is not enough time to get the information you need to even start the freaking call, let alone leave the customer happy. Hi, thank you for calling X Bank. Can I have your 16-digit account number, your name, your mother's maiden name? Before we begin, your balance as of today is X, your last payment of X was received on X, and your next payment of X is due on X. If you haven't already signed up for paperless billing, please let me know before the call is over and I can do that for you. Automatic payments are also available. Please let me know and I can set them up for you as well. Please be advised all calls are monitored and may be recorded for quality purposes. At the end of this call, there will be a survey. Please don't hang up so you can complete it. What is the reason for your call today? Dude, there's 60 seconds gone and you haven't even heard them explain why they called yet. I can't even imagine trying to help someone with a complex medical issue. OP responded saying, the 90 seconds was after the call ended. The calls had a different time limit that was reasonable, and the stuff that we needed to report could not be accessed during the call, so we couldn't delay ending the call to fill those either. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy awesome stories of malicious compliance, why not hit those like and subscribe buttons down below? That said, our next story is email above anything else. I'm not sure if this story belongs here or in Am I the Jerk? Let's start with a bit of background. I work for a very big company, but due to my specialty, my work is split across the main company and one of the smaller companies. The MD of the main company allows my days to be split in half. The big company is very laid back when it comes to my work. As long as my work is done by the deadline date, they pretty much don't care what I do during the work week. In the smaller company, I report to the C-suite, but the CEO, let's call the CEO Raw, cause the sun doesn't rise until he gets out of bed. Raw is most interested in what I do during the day. If I didn't know better, I'd say that Ra thinks that I don't work but sit around playing computer games all day. Ra send anything 20 to 30 emails to me per day, and more than half will be the same question, just phrased differently. Each email response is usually anything from 2 to 5 typed pages. I've even had emails sent to me at 11 p.m. and at 8:30 the following morning, an email asking why I haven't responded to the previous email. If I'm asked the same question multiple times, I ignore the majority of the emails and only answer the question once. When I'm working, I need to concentrate, and most days I close my email client so that I'm not disturbed. Last Monday, I'm working quite happily, and I get a WhatsApp from them asking to please read an email and respond post-haste. To quote Ra, I stop what I'm doing as I get the sinking feeling that something bad is about to happen. As per usual, there are 30 emails from Ra. The first email starts off by stating, "You must always answer emails as quickly as possible, as it is unprofessional and shows disrespect to the writer of the email." Cue malicious compliance. I stop what I'm doing and start to respond to each email individually, making sure that my answers to the same questions are different. I further indicate that I only work for him half day and will stop my work at exactly the middle of the workday. I spend the next day and a half responding to emails and not doing my work, even though there's a deadline looming for RA and his little company. These days, when I walk into the office in the morning, Ra seems to have spent the entire night responding to the emails, and in the process, dragging other members of staff into the email trail, and the email is getting so complex that I don't know what's going on. Yesterday, I was expected to have finished Ra's work, and when asked to present the outcome, I simply said that I had not finished. When asked why, my response was that I was so busy responding to emails, I wasn't able to do the work. Ra lost his mind and started to threaten me with being fired. He said that there was a customer that was waiting for the result of my work. He then asks why was emails put above doing my work, and all I did was produce a copy of the email. My boss from the big company was also present, and all she did was laugh. She then told Ra that I will no longer do any work for his company, and he must find somebody else. "I can't believe you did exactly the thing I told you to do. What are you thinking?" Provides the script from them, ordering them to do said thing. My favorite is when people, when presented with the proof that they were told to do that, the bosses try to pivot and say, "Well, you just misunderstood me. I didn't mean it like that. It sounded like I meant for you to do that. Clearly, this is all your fault, not me." Appropriate Rip 996 wrote, "I have glass walls to my office so I can be seen at all times. Sometimes I have to do video editing. I'm concentrating, I'm working. I get knocks on the glass like I'm a zoo animal. They don't stop until I answer. I then try to get back into the project. Repeat. Sometimes they pound on the glass." Sean BZA responded to that saying, "Every interruption, take a 15-minute break and note the interruption on the workflow. After the first missed deadline, you simply bring up that you'd been disturbed X number of times during the job, and each one took a half hour to rewind the edit back to a save point, and then carry on and try to redo the edit again. But that each interruption kept you from doing so most of the day. Pivot the blame on those who will not take no for a response, and let them do the explanation for why the thing they blew the deadline was so important and could not be conveyed in an email." Our next story is, "Can't switch with one preacher? I'll switch with the other." For context, I'm a pastor in a large denomination that takes years to become fully recognized or ordained as a clergy person. There are several interviews with different teams to see if a person is fit to serve. When the story occurred, I was already past 4 steps and working on the last and final step to be ordained. Part of this step required recording and submitting a sermon on one of only a set number of biblical texts. Sermons using outside texts would not be accepted. At the time, I was an associate pastor in a relatively large church, almost 1,000 on a Sunday between multiple services, and I was initially hired to be one of the primary preachers. However, the senior pastor would set the sermon series, sermon topics, and scriptures for each Sunday. We were asked to stay on theme and on topic for any service in which we preached. Soon after I arrived at this church, the senior pastor, who had been there for many years, announced their retirement. An interim would take their place until the next long-term pastor was selected. We'll call this interim Pastor Richard. The first time I met with Pastor Richard, after the former pastor's retirement and his start, he told me that he didn't think I had what it took to be a pastor. He then proceeded to strip me of nearly all my pastoral responsibilities. Prior to his arrival, I regularly preached 3 or 4 Sundays a month, was called for visits, and oversaw the sacraments. After the meeting with Pastor Richard, I was relegated to organizing a team of 125 volunteers, ensuring we had liturgists, ushers, greeters, and parking lot attendants. My preaching was also cut to just once a month at best. And even though I was working on my paperwork for the final step toward ordination, Pastor Richard refused to schedule any of the biblical texts required for the sermon for my ordination paperwork. To his credit, he did say that I could use whatever verses from the Bible that I wanted, so long as I stayed on theme for the sermon and series. However, I refuse to bend scripture to say something that it doesn't. If a text is about forgiveness, I won't try and proof text it to make it fit a theme of justice. Somehow, every time I was scheduled to preach, the theme of the sermon did not fit any of the handful of texts I was allowed to preach for my paperwork. For anyone curious, it was also a requirement that the sermon be delivered in the church you were serving at the time, meaning I couldn't fill in for someone else in order to complete the task. Eventually, Pastor Richard's interim tenure was drawing to a close. There was one Sunday between his departure and the next senior pastor's arrival. That Sunday was not part of a sermon series and did not have a selected theme. It was Preacher's Choice. This would have been perfect because I could get at least one sermon recorded for my paperwork to submit. Usually you'd want to record all of the texts so that you could choose the best one of the group. However, I was not scheduled as one of the preachers for any of the services. The 2 scheduled preachers for Sunday were Greg and Sarah. Greg was not a pastor and was not on track to become a pastor. So I went to Pastor Richard and asked if I could take Greg's place so that I could record at least one sermon for submission for ordination. Richard told me that I could not switch with Greg and he would not allow me to take his place. I agreed that I would not take Greg's place and left his office. But shortly after I left Richard's office, I went over and met with Sarah. I knew she wanted that particular weekend off, so I offered to switch preaching assignments. I would take the weekend I wanted, and she would switch for a weekend a month down the line. Sarah immediately agreed, and I went to the person who sent our weekly email and had the information switched. I didn't ask permission, and I didn't tell Richard what I'd done. The email went out on Wednesday night, and on Thursday morning when Richard came in, the first thing he did was come into my office. He demanded to know why I disobeyed his order. I simply pointed out that he told me I couldn't preach in Greg's place, which I wasn't. Instead, I would preach in Sarah's place. There wasn't much he could do because the information had already been sent out to the church, so he left my office in a rage. I preached on Sunday using one of the required texts and used it to submit for the final step in my ordination. Unfortunately, I was not ordained that year. It would take me another year beyond that. But the look on his face when he realized I had followed his order to the letter and there was nothing he could do about it still makes me chuckle years later. I just don't understand why he was so against OP making any progress in their career, in what they want to do with the rest of their life. And plus, this is just an interim guy, right? So there's no real skin in the game of trying to assert their role or try to make sure that OP can't usurp them and take the job. Upset Pachyderm wrote, "You didn't say why Pastor Richard had it in for you. Do you know?" OP responded to that saying, "Hard to truly say." A couple church members took issue with the fact that I went on parental leave when my daughter was born and felt that the husband's job was to continue working and the wife's job was to stay home. My first meeting with Pastor Richard was just after coming off of leave. Our next story is, I warned her, Camp Edition. Traumatized them back, thought you all would like my story. In the late 70s, I went to Girl Scout camp. It was great, but one night they served boiled spinach. And as fate would have it, I'd been playing with pond moss that very afternoon. Add to this, I'd tried spinach once at a friend's house and I threw up. Mom despised spinach, so it hadn't crossed my plate any other time. At dinner that night, our vegetable was boiled spinach. I told the counselors, "I can't eat this, I'll throw up. If you don't take at least 3 brownie bites, you can't have dessert." "What is dessert?" I queried. "Ice cream sandwiches," answered the counselors. Dang. Game on. Okay, I want that. I'm going to take a bite and puke. Should I aim for the railing? It was semi-outdoors. The counselors had stopped caring. Sounds good. I took the bite, swallowed it, and promptly puked over the railing. Suddenly, they are all action and rushed me to the one-stall bathroom that was occupied. I puked in the sink until the vile green crap was out of my system. As I wiped my mouth with the paper towel, I said, "So, do I need to take my other 2 bites?" Several counselors asked me shortly thereafter, "If you knew you were going to throw up, why did you eat it?" "I love ice cream sandwiches," I answered. My sweet mother raised heck upon my return from camp that summer, and the forced 3-bite rule went away at Camp Wanaka for many, many years. If you don't eat your meat, you can't have any pudding. I'll tell you one thing, OP's a trailblazer. Anytime any of those people came across another kid that said, "I'm gonna throw up," they probably took them very seriously. Retired night shift wrote, "My mom cooked pork chops into leather because if undercooked, we could get worms." You had to have good teeth to eat my mom's pork chops. OP responded saying, "Salmon was such a delightful surprise when I first tried it as an adult. Mom's fish was leather, and McDonald's Filet-O-Fish was odd, though edible. I didn't have good seafood until I was in college in the early 90s. I'm realizing how ridiculous this is since the Pacific Ocean is 10 miles that way." Our next story is, change the business name? Okay. Sometimes just the threat of malicious compliance is all you need. Years ago, a gentleman owned a chain of auto parts stores. He always named each store Name of Town Auto Parts and put the initials on the building. One of the stores was in a town that started with a W, inadvertently placing in, at the time, racial slur on the building. I'll let you go down the rabbit hole. After being up there for many years, the city fathers, think City Hall today, came down and told him he needed to take that down because it's offensive. The owner said, "It's the initials of the business, how is it offensive?" The city says, "We don't care, take it down or else." At that point, the owner looks them dead in the eye and says, "Okay, I'll change the business names to Frank's United Chicken Kitchen and put those initials up there." It took the fathers all of a minute to say, "Never mind, keep it like it is." They left and never had any other issues with them about the sign. Honestly, I wanted to see him go through with this malicious compliance because he went from an auto parts store to a place that's technically called Frank's United Chicken Kitchen. Franklin2543 wrote, "Reminds me that the Urban Dictionary entry defining those initials as wireless access point had been around a lot longer than the other one." Rambling Reflections replied, "I'm a network admin. When Cardi B came out with WAP, I had to change my terminology at work quick smart. I'll never forget the giggling fit the teaching grad had when I arrived to her class and told her I was there to have a look at her non-functional WAP. They're now wireless APs. Our next story is, want me to use old pallets? Alright then. So a few years back, I worked for a brick/block making firm. I was using the cuber, a machine that would push the bricks and blocks onto a wooden pallet. I was tasked with stacking newly made bricks on pallets and stacking said pallets in the shed to keep them out of the weather. I was using the new pallets like we normally do for the bricks, as they would be stacked 4 pallets high, about 8 meters tall or about 26 feet. My boss yelled at me saying, "Just use the old pallets." I replied with, "The old pallets are not strong enough for that weight." Well, he was always right and demanded to do as he said. Skip to a few hours later, and I hear my boss yelling and swearing up a storm. One of the old pallets at the bottom collapsed, destroying about 4,000 worth of product. He starts yelling at me and putting the blame on me. Now, this was a long time coming and I was done being blamed for his screw-ups. I stood over him and started yelling back, "You told me to use the old pallets. I did as you said, so don't you dare blame me for your screw-up." I then turned around and left. Now, he didn't like to admit he was wrong, but when I got to my station the next Monday, there was a new toolkit sitting there for me. This is the prime situation where you try to make sure that you do have it in writing. I'm glad that in the end it was at least like silently acknowledged that OP was right and it was something that they said and demanded be done. But man, last thing you want to do is be potentially on the line for 4,000 or multiple thousands of dollars of product, and all you have to back you up is a he said, she said with your higher up. Ludwig of the Potato People wrote, "I used to do shipping in a warehouse, all the UPS and FedEx. I was super picky about the UPS pallets. They could be loaded up with 1,000+ pounds of material by the time they came to pick up, sometimes over a ton on one and rarely both. If the pallets didn't come back the next day, I had 4 in rotation, 2 go out as yesterday's 2 come back. I would head over to the inbound side of the warehouse and hunt down a couple good big pallets. Reason being, crappy pallets would break when you pick them up to put them on the wrapper/scale. Sometimes they'd get freaked up in transit, in loading or unloading, or they'd have to switch trailers, and the old ones were left in a different one. There was one week my pallets weren't coming back at all. Asked the UPS guy to remind his unloaders that we needed them back every day. Our next story is not until 4:01 malicious compliance. I work in a place that has a queue taking incoming calls until 4 p.m. It's generally always busy, always understaffed, but that's the nature of the beast. I work the closing shift, where you generally come in at a later time and stay later. So a few years back, I used to work extra hard trying to get my end of work duties done early between calls in order to leave early right when we shut down. Manager was totally on board with this. Sometimes I'd be done by 4:10, sometimes 4:45. Didn't matter. I left when my work was done and rarely had to stay to my full 5 p.m. Enter the supervisor, person right under manager, and the person who complains about having never enough time to do her job when she spends 60% of said time out of her seat gossiping with other coworkers. Okay, not my circus, not my monkeys. I ignore it and proceed to keep it my habit of working my butt off to get done early. This usually meant multitasking between calls and adding extra stress to work off a sheet for another aspect of our job. This goes well for years until supervisor starts wondering why calls aren't retrieved from voicemail after hours. Never mind that it's my job to get them in the morning following, which I always do. Eventually I decide, okay, I'll stop working double when the queue is active and save that work for 4:01 since that would make her feel better. No problem. I refuse to do anything but answer calls because that's my immediate priority. Fast forward months later, and supervisor is constantly asking people to help on the list between calls. Nope, not until 4:01, ma'am. Meanwhile, the actual manager, the one in charge, is happy as a clam with super high productivity. After all, I'm focusing on calls only until 4:01, at which time I'll start my closing duties and not a minute before. Update. Okay, first of all, I apologize for the vagueness of the OG post. I've had a quiet laugh about some of the comments and I'm sorry for the confusion. I'll try and clarify where I can, and I've updated and edited because you all had a field day about our work abbreviation of the word Q into QUE. I work for a hospital, so I have to be careful how I explain things and how much for HIPAA, and honestly, just because I don't want to be too identifiable. Secondly, a few of the replies got the basic gist correct. In the hospital call center environment, we take literally hundreds of calls from both patients and offices to schedule things. On top of this, we've been severely understaffed since COVID, and as a result, we have less people taking calls than we should, and more work being assigned to less people to struggle to get it done. We have basically like the work of 3 people being assigned to 1 or 2, and that's assuming we have even the staff for it. We don't. So a lot of what's been happening is instead of working my butt off to get more stuff done during the day and leaving early as was always permitted by my manager, I am saving all my closing stuff until the last minute. It still only takes like 10 to 20 minutes max anyway, but it means leaving other people to do their job instead of me working my butt off to do theirs for them just to save 20 minutes on average. Still much less stressful this way, and I'm enjoying it a lot more now. You ever have a job where you work for somebody that is so awesome that you'd be willing to break your back a little bit more just to get some extra stuff done? Especially if it ends up being an arrangement where it works out even better for the both of you? Only seems to last as long as that good manager does. What are the chances the next person that comes in to oversee everything, or the next higher up that steps in to just review everything, is also going to be cool enough to be like, this is a cool thing you got going, seems to be productive, seems to help morale, and not just immediately go, screw you. Our next story is one coffee coming right up. I worked at a cafe in a big shopping center for a few months between jobs I actually liked. The manager was a nut and liked to throw her weight around. Every evening, she'd tell me to clean the coffee machine and get ready to close up. Every evening, once I was done, she would ask me to make her a coffee for the road. I'd have to make it and then clean everything again. I offered to make it for her before I cleaned the machine, but she complained that it wouldn't be hot enough. I received a better job offer and was looking forward to one more week before leaving. However, the next night she wanted her coffee after we'd already had to stay back, and I definitely wasn't getting paid overtime. Everyone had left 30 minutes before. I had had enough. I took care to spill coffee grounds everywhere, use as many utensils and jugs as I could, and just make a huge mess. As I handed her the coffee, I told her I quit. The look on her face was priceless as she realized she'd be the one cleaning up. Worth being poor for a week. And on the other spectrum, you ever have somebody that you worked for that you despised enough that you'd want to spill coffee grounds all over the place and walk out? I gotta say, it must have felt pretty nice for OP to finally just say, take your stupid after work after cleaned machine coffee. PN Gwyn wrote, if she made you work unpaid overtime, this would have been wage theft. Depending on where you live, this can be rather expensive for the owners. Expensive enough that the manager would have gotten sacked immediately, and you could have had a paid vacation. Our next story is, if you have a problem, it better be a 15-minute problem. My husband told me a story yesterday about his act of malicious compliance that happened about a decade ago. In a previous job, he worked 8 to 4 in an office. Many of his colleagues worked in 9 to 5, so they were still working when he was leaving. When he was about to leave, he would usually be asked a technical question, or asked to quickly glance over something by another member of staff. This was rarely quick, and usually had him standing around for a further 10 minutes, which, on a regular basis, starts to add up. One day, his manager was going over the monthly timesheets and asked my husband why he added 10 minutes on 5 days across the past month. Bear in mind, flexi time was allowed. My husband explained the situation, referring to the specific problems he was asked to deal with on each of those 5 days. The manager told him that the company only works in 15-minute segments, so we can't put down 10 minutes, it would have to be 15 minutes. However, we can't round it up because that's dishonest, he said, so just bear it in mind for next time. This was in front of the rest of the office. That very same week, my husband signs out of his computer at 4 p.m. Just before he leaves, the manager asks him to explain some of the particulars in an email he'd received from a contractor. My husband asks, "How long will it take?" The manager replies, "Just 5 minutes." My husband then says, "Unless it's a 15-minute problem, I'll have to look at it tomorrow." "Is it a 15-minute problem?" His manager turns red and awkwardly says it is not. My husband respectfully states that he will put it at the top of his to-do list the following morning and leaves. One of his colleagues texted him just after 5 and said there was an awkward silence after he'd left, and when the manager eventually got up and left to do something, they all burst out laughing. Edit, some people were asking about wage theft. He eventually had the 15 minutes added back on after the policy revealed that he could round it up if it was a task that took 7.5 minutes or more, and down if it wasn't. The manager seemed genuinely unaware of this when it was raised. He was salaried, so he wasn't concerned about losing income, just about losing flexi time that could have helped him put if something unprecedented happened, like being stuck in traffic one day. I think managers should spend a certain amount of time a week looking over their own policies, or at least find out what they are before making any kind of instruction. Catherine Yu wrote, "I had someone in my office who would come to me right before I was about to leave and asked really complex questions that would usually have me staying an extra half an hour each day. Usually I didn't mind because I would claim the credit time, but sometimes I had plans and didn't feel like staying around. There was an empty office across from mine, and somehow I'd been given a master key when I'd started, so I could open any door in the office. I never abused the privilege of this, but I began going into the empty office a half an hour before the end of my workday and finish working there so I could leave on time. I would always hear him go to my space 10 minutes before I was set to leave, lightly knock, see I wasn't there, and then I would hear him leave. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another awesome malicious compliance story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.